Let me expand a little bit on what I mean by depth and breadth. So, in large part, not all of what I'm talking about here, but a great deal of it comes from two books that I read that had a really big impact on me. One is called Range by David Epstein. The other is called The Intelligence Trap by David Robson. Basically, what these two books do is they are questioning conventional understandings of intelligence and expertise and how we understand or appreciate or value these concepts in our world. Now, Range, the general argument of that book, is that it is better to have a range of knowledge that reaches out in many different directions in your life than to remain extremely narrowly focused on one thing for your entire life. This would be the example I used earlier, right? That it is much better to be an auto mechanic or a doctor or a miner or an accountant who has many other intellectual pursuits than it is to be any one of those fields where the person's obsessed with and focused entirely on this one area in which they work. I'll talk about why that is throughout this week's content. But that's his basic point, is that to be a generalist is very important. It gives you a wider perspective on the world. Again, I'll go into that in more detail. David Robson, on the other hand, is thinking about how we value expertise and how we define expertise. And he makes the point that expertise certainly affords people a level of intelligence that is, for that person, makes them feel like an authority. However, there are different ways of being intelligent. And I can very much affirm that this is, based on my experience, true. There were many professors and students and colleagues that I knew throughout my graduate years where to them, the most important thing was that they knew as much as possible so that they could be smart. And often that led them to treat others that they perceived to be less intelligent. It led them to treat those people somewhat disrespectfully or even, harshly in general ways. And I certainly experienced that in the competitive atmosphere of grad school, where certain people made assumptions about me, especially because I was the youngest or one of the youngest grad students in the program. And they assumed that I was less capable because I had less experience and I was younger. And they used their experience and their intelligence as a way of sort of criticizing me or judging me. Now, that's one of the things that Robson tackles in his book in a roundabout way by pointing out that intelligence needs to actually come with humility in order to be meaningful. That someone who's arrogant and intelligent is inevitably going to make a lot of mistakes in their career because they put themselves above the possibility of making mistakes. And therefore they don't know when they make mistakes or they don't notice when they're about to happen. A truly intelligent person, according to David Robson, is somebody who doesn't just possess intelligence, but who possesses the mindset that ties into like that growth mindset idea, where they don't ever believe their learning to have ended, and that their learning doesn't afford them absolute authority over anything, most especially knowledge. Again, I'm going to talk about this more throughout this class, but the basic idea here, David Epstein's point, read broadly, learn broadly, experience broadly, and you'll have a much richer base of knowledge to use across your life. And David Robson's point, if you're going to be smart, be reflective as well as smart. Think about what you don't know as much as you think about what you do know. Two basic ideas here. Now, when we talk about specialization, I've mentioned this already, but I'll just go into a reminder here. I'm talking about learning one thing extremely well and in extremely fine detail. For example, becoming a medical doctor, you go to school for many years, you go to conferences, you write papers, you publish, and then you practice medicine. That's how you demonstrate your expertise and specialization as a doctor. Depth is so specialization would represent sort of a depth of knowledge. And depth means that you take time to learn that specialization. So doctors, as I've said, they go to school, and then they don't just specialize in medicine, but they specialize in one particular area of medicine, like an ear, nose, and throat doctor, for example. And once those doctors become practicing professionals, after they've gone through this period of establishing their authority and their specialization, they continue to update their knowledge of this specialization by reading medical journals and attending conferences for the rest of their careers. So depth and specialization are obviously very important. We want doctors who keep up with their areas of interest and areas of study and expertise. We want doctors who update their knowledge and keep on adding depth to their knowledge of their fields. In this lecture, though, I'm not going to talk too much about specialization because I think we all know what we mean by specialization. You've picked a program, many students pick a program, they pour everything into finishing that program, and anything that's not a part of that program, sometimes they view as a distraction. This is always my experience when I teach writing or history or courses that are outside of people's expertise or areas of interest. They see those outside courses as a distraction from their main focus. So if they are studying in police foundations and I'm teaching them history, they see my history course as a distraction from their emphasis on police foundations. What they're not really grasping when someone views my course or any elective course in that way, what they're not really grasping is that it is very important to actually expand perspectives on the world, and you can never predict what will be useful to you. It's impossible to predict that. I often have had students in the past say things like, well, the reason I'm not putting everything into your course is because I'll never use this. And I always say, how do you know that? Like, how do you know that for the next 70, 80 years of your life, you will never, ever find this information helpful? It will never be useful to know something about the past or about writing or communication or critical thinking or psychology. How do you know you will never need that? And I can give you an example right away that if, for example, someone was going into nursing and they told me, which they have sometimes, that they don't need my history course about Canada, the first question I ask them is, well, are you aware of problems in Canada when it comes to healthcare and Indigenous people? Because there is a real inequality in terms of the quality and kinds of healthcare that Indigenous people have access to in this country. And my course talks about the history of Indigenous Canadian relations by focusing on some of the issues that are still influencing things like medicine, education, and child welfare and things like that today. My point is that maybe that nurse, pre-nursing, pre-med student, whatever, maybe that student doesn't see the connection, but that doesn't mean there will never be one. This is why David Epstein says we need to really acquire range in our perspective. And this is what I'm calling breadth. So this means learning broadly to expand one's perspective on the world. This might mean you travel broadly. It doesn't mean you have to take education all across the world. You just travel. Maybe it means you read or study different issues, different courses, different ideas, or you simply just experience things outside of your normal life. You go to a different neighborhood in London or in anywhere in Ontario to experience a different way of living, a different experience. Two examples of range that I'm going to talk about, range or breadth. I'm using these terms interchangeably. One is learning outside of your expertise. So if you're a nursing student or an engineer, let's say, you make time to read about poetry, right? You go outside of your area. And in fact, this was at one time a mandatory component of nursing programs in Canada, that they were required to read a book called The Stone Angel in the 1980s. Young nurses and students, they were required to read this book. And the reason is because this book was about a 90-year-old woman who is dying from, I believe, cancer. And it goes into a lot of inner exploration of her mental state, how she's handling her confrontation with dying. And nurses were asked to read this book in order to develop a bedside manner. So there's a good example of how learning outside the facts and figures and data that inform nursing practices, you read something fictional, a book by a 30-something-year-old author who's imagining a 90-year-old woman dying on her, from cancer late in life, and that benefits the nurse's experience of their own job, even though that connection might not seem obvious at first. So learning outside of your expertise can be helpful. Another thing is exploring different ideas related to your expertise. So if, for example, someone teaches American history, maybe they take time to learn about Canadian history as well, even if they don't ever teach Canadian history. But it's useful to think about how, for example, Canadian and American relationships might look from the perspective of a Canadian. So you can learn broadly within a field or broadly outside of a field. And either way, these are exercises in broadening your experience and perspective. Now, it's important also to recognize here that I'm not making someone choose between being a specialist or someone with range. You can be a specialist with range. So, for instance, my PhD, my thesis, was in Canadian studies. I did a Canadian history and literature and politics PhD. And my PhD led me to write a book about this stuff. I taught courses in the universities across the country. I did lectures across the world on this material. I did a lecture in Japan several years ago. This is something that was very much my specialization. However, in the years since then, I've moved on, in addition to my specialization, I've moved on to consider other things I know nothing about. So I started reading about a wide range of topics, including creativity. This course is not, well, until recently anyway, was not my specialization. It was brand new to me. It was a totally different detour from everything I had done in my earlier career. In addition to teaching things outside of my earliest area of expertise and specialization, I also make time in my personal life to read about science and technology and, yes, Bitcoin, because I'm interested to get a broader perspective on the world in which I live. And sometimes that content helps me understand my teaching better, even though I could never have predicted that. And you'll see examples today where I'm going to give you an example of Johann Kepler, a scientist from the Renaissance era, or pre-Renaissance era, the scientific revolution anyway. And I'm going to talk about Kepler as an example of range and broad experience. But the only way I ever came across Kepler's example was by reading broadly in sciences and technology. So the core lesson for today, it's important and great to specialize in something. In fact, it's essential to get employment, to be some kind of a specialist. However, if someone focuses too much on their specialization, if they do not ever aspire to break out of the confines of their specialization, then they limit their potential for critical thinking and creativity. That is the main thing I want you to understand today. Specialization is super important, but so is range. So depth, very important. Breadth, also very important. A person who favors depth is an expert. A person who favors breadth is a generalist, someone who has a general set of interests. But a person who balances depth and breadth, that's a person who is creative. That's what we're talking about today.